Hello and welcome to this, our seventh class on the book of Revelation, subtitled Apocalypse as Hope. This week, we will be going over an interlude, specifically an interlude found immediately after where we left off last week. And let's look at last week and what we did. Last week, we took a hard look at the sixth chapter of Revelation. And in that chapter, the first six of the seven seals were opened. And we learned about the symbolism behind the events that accompanied the opening of each seal, the significance of the four horsemen, of how the slaughtered saints under the altar were comforted with white robes, and of how the sixth seal revealed the judgment to be indiscriminate, falling on the poor and royalty alike. If the last week seemed a lot to take in, I think that the authors anticipate this, for now we have a break in the action. We'll have to wait for the next chapter to discover what happens when the seventh seal is opened. But for now, we'll consider the ways the reader or the hearer of this letter is comforted and assured in spite of all that they've heard so far. Perhaps they are worried that they too will be swallowed up and destroyed as the empire that surrounds them gets their comeuppance. If so, these next words are meant to assure them that their efforts and struggles in service to Jesus have not been for naught. And let's dive right in, starting with reading verses 1 through 3 of chapter 7. Remember, the sixth seal is just opened. After this, I saw four angels standing at the four corners of the earth, holding back the four winds of the earth so that no wind could blow on earth or sea or against any tree. I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun with the seal of the living God, and he called with a loud voice to the four angels who had been given power to damage earth and sea, saying, "Do not damage the earth or the sea or the trees until we have marked the servants of our God with a seal on their foreheads." Here, the process of the slaughtered lamb, that's Jesus, opening the seven seals pauses before the final seal is opened. And it's a good thing, too. The last chapter told of the unsealing of the first six seals, and each unsealing was accompanied by calamity and disaster. That is, with the exception of the fifth seal, which accompanied a scene where those who shared in the suffering of Christ were encouraged and comforted. Hint, hint. Chapter 7 serves the same purpose, but in a more expansive and poignant way. So if you're looking for your interpretive framework, remember the fifth seal and what that signified and how it was meant to assure the saints still living that they would not be forgotten and that those who had been put asunder were remembered. This is more or less an extension of that idea. It is as if the author of Revelation, John, the Holy Spirit, anticipates anxiety and uncertainty upon hearing these things. What a Christian enduring such times wants to know is, will I make it through? And will it all be worth it? Chapter 7 is the answer to the question raised at the end of chapter 6, which read, "For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand?" Who is able to stand? The answer is fleshed out here in chapter 7. Some comments on what we just read. Here we have a word picture meant to make a certain point intermixed with ancient cosmological assumptions. We will try to parse out the overall point from the dated cosmology to prevent us missing the forest for the trees. The ancient cosmological assumptions were that 1, the world was flat, 2, the four winds were controlled by mythological divine forces, John's understanding of the earth as four-cornered and of its elements, wind, water, fire, being controlled by angels was typical of the time. You can see other examples of this in the scripture in Matthew 24:31, Isaiah 11:12, and Ezekiel 7, verse 2. In this case, the four winds are described as ascribed to four angels, each with the power to use the winds as a destructive force. When wind wreaked havoc on human civilization, hurricanes, tornadoes, etc., it was debated as to what role such divine forces may have in the destruction. Were the gods angry when the wind blew in destructive ways? Here, the angels who mitigate the wind's forces on earth serve primarily in a defensive role. We find them holding back the wind so as to curtail its destructive forces. Here is an extension of the divine protection from sin's chaos implied by the still glassy sea before the throne of God. However, given the calamity wrought by the four horsemen mentioned in chapter 5, it would seem that God's people need assurances and comfort in the face of current and pending travails. In anticipation of the need for these assurances, a new angel is introduced. This one contained the seal of the living God. This seal is unlike the seals on the scroll, as in a wax seal to close up a letter. Rather, this is a seal indicating that this divine messenger speaks and acts with the authority of the living God, as opposed to the alleged God Caesar, who will die. So think of this seal as a little mark or badge that indicates the significance of this messenger. And this seal would not have been a wax seal, but rather a mark on a signet or a medallion that one might wear as a ring or a necklace. The mark would have been specific to the person in authority it represented and hard to replicate. The mark was meant to assure the receiver that the messenger or representative carried with them the full authority to speak on behalf of the one who sent them. In this scene, a fifth angel is introduced, one who bears the mark of God and so has authority to tell the four winds to continue to restrain their destructive forces until, quoting, "we have marked the servants of our God with a seal on their foreheads." Here is a promise to those who endure through such times that God will not allow them to be swallowed up by the destructive forces unleashed by the Roman Empire onto the entire world. In fact, God will sanction such events to transpire until all the faithful have been given a seal of divine protection. Biblical commentators note that ancient readers or hearers familiar with the Hebrew prophets would have immediately recognized the parallels between the scene described here and another described in Ezekiel. Of this, Dr. Brian Blunt writes, "If the sealing is anything like the sealing that takes place in the story of Ezekiel 9, 4-8, upon which 7, 1-3 is surely based, then its function is to afford divine protection. In Ezekiel's account, God commissioned 6 executioners to slaughter the idolatrous inhabitants of Jerusalem. At just the moment when the reader expected the bloodbath to begin, however, there was an intermission. Before commencing the kill, God ordered that all those who grieved the abominable behavior be branded with a mark upon their foreheads. When an executioner saw the mark, he was to pass by the persons who bore it, leaving them unharmed. Precisely the same scenario play itself out here. God's fierce and final judgment awaits the Lamb's breaking of the 7th seal. At just the moment when the reader expects God to act, the 5th of God's agents calls time out so that certain believers can be branded with a protective mark on their forehead. A similar branding took place in the Genesis account, where the mark is placed upon Cain, and that acted as a seal of protection from future harm. One might argue similarly that the Hebrews in Exodus 12 sealed themselves with the mark of the Lamb's blood on their doorposts. So you have playing on this theme that repeats itself in the Hebrew Bible. The overall point, through whatever calamity that may be on the horizon, God has marked the faithful and will not allow them to be consumed by the destructive forces unleashed on the world. Even the metaphorical winds are held at bay until all have been marked for safety and protection. But reading on, "And I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000, sealed out of every tribe of the people of Israel. From the tribe of Judah, 12,000 sealed. From the tribe of Reuben, 12,000. From the tribe of Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh." And here I'm not going to repeat it because it repeats 12,000, 12,000, 12,000. Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph. And from the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000 sealed. As for this list, Judah's placed first. There's no Ephraim. There's no Dan. There's something to note. We're not going to make much of it here, but there are several places where the lists of the tribes of Israel differ from one another. Here's one where it differs in that it doesn't include Ephraim or Dan as the original list would. 144,000 is a very specific number, and this matters, but probably not in the way that some may think. Those without an understanding of the symbolism some numbers carry for Jews and early Christians may well miss the entire point. I've heard it before, that exactly 144,000 from the tribes of Israel will be sealed, as if the 144,000th and first just misses the cut. I'm reminded of the lifeboats and the Titanic here, and those just left out. But the number is not meant to be taken as a literal counting of the exact number from the tribes of Israel that will be sealed and rescued by God. Of this, Brian Blount writes, the number, 144,000, is clearly not to be taken literally. It symbolizes wholeness. John has taken a figure representative of completion, the number 12, multiplied by itself, and then extended the total in a millenarian way. 12 times 12 times 1,000 equals 144,000. It is representative of the whole or complete remnant people. The double use of 12 signifies both the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles of the Lamb. John will later confirm this inclusive reading of the two 12s in his description of the New Jerusalem in 21 verses 12 through 14. The city has a great wall with 12 gates. On each gate is inscribed the name of one of the 12 tribes. The great wall also has 12 foundations, on each of which is inscribed the name of one of the 12 apostles. The number 144,000 symbolizes the same Jew/Gentile inclusiveness implied in the description of the New Jerusalem Great Wall. The total number is the point. Not a specific number, but a way of saying all that may be will be. God will not leave any redemptive work left undone. And here we may address something that's caused great confusion and even controversy around the passage. Just who are these 144,000 supposed to represent? Jews, Gentiles, or both? Well, one clue comes later in chapter 14, where these 144,000 are mentioned again. But this time they are marked with the lamb on their forehead, indicating that whoever they are followers of Jesus, the slaughtered lamb. But there are other clues to suggest that John is using Israel symbolically here, and not in reference to any single national identity. By the time of its writing, around 95 Common Era, both Gentile and Jewish Christians referred to the church as Israel, emphasizing a broader spiritual connection to the Jewish story, one that transcends ethnic ties. You can see some of this evidenced in Paul's writings in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 21, and then repeated in chapter 3, verses 5 through 6. It would make sense for John to address his audience with this understanding of Israel in mind. This understanding becomes even more plausible as we continue to read about the 144,000 who symbolically represent both the 12 tribes of Israel as well as the 12 apostles. The apostles oversaw an era when they welcomed Gentiles into their communities as full members. The remnant left on earth would certainly have included not a few Gentiles, and some of the churches addressed in this letter were comprised of primarily Gentiles. For example, Ephesus, as previously mentioned. Of this, Brian Blount writes, at the close of the first century when John writes, the 12 tribes no longer exist. In this case, Israel would refer not to ethnic Jews, but to all those who exhibit the primary Israelite character trait of belief in the lordship of God and now God's lamb-like Christ. Israel would thus signify the Christian church. In this way, John can envision an eschatologically restored Israel, both comprised of Jews and Gentiles. The presentation of the 144,000 as the restored remnant of Israel's 12 tribes is, then, John's way of eschatologically imagining the universal church. The 144,000 who are sealed with a mark of protection symbolizes those faithful of the earth who wonder if they will be utterly lost or destroyed by the pending calamity. The symbolism behind the number given, 12 times 100, is meant to emphasize the completeness of God's restorative work, even in regards those who suffer through periods of tribulation. The message is basically, God doesn't leave anyone behind. Not one disciple will truly perish, though we may be called to give of our bodies to save our souls. But even still, not one person who joins in the suffering of the slain lamb will be lost or forgotten. God will see to it that the faithful who travail in the present age will not be wholly consumed by it. Like the slaughtered lamb they follow, his disciples will ultimately join in God's triumphant victory over the evils of our present age. Those who work evil may kill the body, as was done to Jesus, but those sealed by God, we faithful, will join the slaughtered lamb in God's presence, triumphant. In the grander scheme of things, we need not fear. The text continues. After this I looked, and there was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, robed in white, with palm branches in their hands. They cried out in a loud voice, saying, "Salvation belongs to our God, who is seated on the throne, and to the Lamb." John and John's readers were meant to take comfort in Revelation's assurances that they would not be crushed beneath the destructive forces unleashed on the earth. But what comes next should both encourage us and surprise us. John's focus is called to the future so that he can appreciate the scale of God's saving ways. Just after, John beholds an image that assures the salvation of 144,000, or the complete number. John's gaze is directed to see a countless number of people. A new vision focuses on a great multitude that contrasts with the 144,000. The multitude is in heaven, not on earth as the 144,000. They are innumerable, not of a limited number, and they consist of people from every nation or political entity, from all tribes and peoples, social entities, and languages, now united by a common language, not just from the tribes of Israel. That's from Leonard Thompson's commentary on Revelation, page 109. And now a quote from David Aoun. Here is, quote, a heavenly assembly that may include, but is not identical to 144,000. So the great multitude, the important point here being, God will ultimately bring about a peace and a reconciliation to the human race that will include a truly countless number of people. The inclusiveness of the vision is striking, writes Christopher Rowland in his commentary on Revelation. So this is good news. Here John sees a number of people so great that no one could possibly have counted it. At this point, hearers and readers could not be blamed for remembering God's promise to Abraham, the pledge that the patriarch's seed would one day grow as innumerable as the sands of the sea and the stars of the heavens. And here are several references to that from Genesis and one from Hebrew. Anyhow, the pledge that the patriarch's seed would one day grow as numerable as the sands of the sea and the stars in the heavens has been accomplished in two significant ways. The first is the count. As God has promised, the numbers are titanic. The second is the vast crowd's universal nature. They represent every nation, tribe, people, and tongue. This means that Jews, Abraham's literal descendants, and Gentiles who have been metaphorically grafted onto Israel's family tree through the gift of the Christ Lamb stand together in their worship, praise, and identification as the people of God. This multitude are wearing dazzling white robes. Up until now, white robes have been given to the faithful who have suffered and thus have been living or dying witnesses to the conquering lordship of Jesus Christ. The fact that they are so dressed is an indication that they have been faithful witnesses and that their witness has contributed to the destruction of satanic rule as well as the liberation of those enslaved to it. The multitude are also holding palm branches, which are also laden with meaning. It could be that we are meant to be reminded of other victory processions where a conquering king or general was welcomed home in triumph. Palm branches were waved in such events, often in deference to the celebration of Caesar, but now they are waved for Jesus. The message here is the same made by Jesus when he entered into Jerusalem triumphantly, just before he was executed. Jesus is our real leader, and his rule is best. This point is hammered home by the short chorus or hymn recorded in verse 10, which begins, "Salvation belongs to God." These words would have been received as heresy by those who had bought into the cult of the emperor, believing their salvation comes from that place. Verses 11 and 12. And all the angels stood around the throne and around the elders and the four living creatures. And they fell on their faces before the throne and worshiped God, singing, Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Amen. Similar to the throne scenes prior, here the worship spreads and the multitude are joined by those described earlier. These visions are an amplification of verses 9 through 10. Here, the heavens join in singing about God's saving works. Words like glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might. These were words often sung by the Caesars or some other dignitaries' attendants in the context of their own throne rooms. So this song has a genre. It's a throne room song, and it's being sung about the living God. Throne rooms now thoroughly outclassed yet again by God's throne room and the song sung therein. And we read on, picking up with verse 13. Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, Who are these robed in white, and where have they come from? I said to them, Sir, you are the one who knows. Then he said to me, These are they who have come out of the great ordeal. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. John is addressed here by one of the 24 elders and is asked if he knows who these robed individuals are. The question, apparently rhetorical, is immediately answered after John expresses his ignorance. Now is confirmed what was already fairly obvious. These are those who have suffered through great persecution, but did not deny Jesus. Instead, they entered into his suffering and find themselves similarly victorious over the forces of evil and death. Brian Blunt writes, This horde of people whom John sees beyond the end of time are those who went through the great tribulation that was described at chapter 6, 1 through 8, 12 through 17, and 7, 1 through 3. And that was anticipated in the letters to the 7 churches. But you should also know that the meaning of the great ordeal in verse 14 is unclear. This could be a general reference to persecutions past. After all, there were many other great ordeals or tribulations in Israel's past, as they had been subjugated, conquered, and persecuted many times throughout the centuries. Or the Great Tribulation could refer to the events described in Revelation 6, the fall of Rome, and all that this would entail. Or the Great Ordeal could be a reference to the belief shared by Christians since Jesus walked on earth, that he ushered in a new era. It was believed that the transition between the old era and the new would be chaotic and a moment in time filled with confusion. Whatever the case, those who refuse to accommodate evil forces in such times are included here in this heavenly multitude. For we, the living, it doesn't matter much which interpretation to take. Our God will see us through either way. Moving on to verses 15 through 17. For this reason, they are before the throne of God and worship him day and night within his temple. And the one who is seated on the throne will shelter them. They will hunger no more and thirst no more. The sun will not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of water of life. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. When I was a child, there were moments in each church service when the congregants were invited to give something called a testimony. Testimonies about heaven and perpetual worship. This is not your typical worship service. This is a continuance and a building on the worship we have been reading about thus far. Ever since the throne room scene was introduced, we've been met with a variety of heavenly creatures who have lavished praise on God. The first words out of the 4 living creatures' mouths were holy, 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 and the worship has only built up from there. Each escalation in the scale and volume of the worship corresponds with a new revelation about God's salvific efforts. Each revelation widens the scope of God's work. Now, a new choir is added to the mix, a countless multitude of humans of every kind. Now, it's time to crank up the volume until it breaks. Although it won't. Because this worship of everything true, good, and beautiful, manifest by the presence of our Creator, God, and his Son, the slaughtered Lamb, well, it will continue. There is no amount of celebratory worship that will ever adequately express the scope and scale of God's love. I mean, how long will it take before you tire of praising the sunrise? You also have here a description of the temple. It's within his temple where this is happening. And you may have noticed that the worship described here happens day and night within his temple. So wait a minute. Those of you who have read ahead to chapter 21 may know that it clearly states that there will be no temple. But it goes on to say the reason why. The very presence of God and the Lamb provide the shelter in which the people worship, and endlessly too. Because for this reason, they are before the throne of God and worship him day and night within his temple. And the one who is seated on the throne will shelter them. They will hunger no more, thirst no more. The sun will not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of water of life, and will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Brian Blunt writes, in what many call the longest allusion to an Old Testament passage in the book of Revelation, John draws upon the vision of Isaiah 49 verse 10 to assure his hearers and readers that those who faithfully witness, who resist accommodating themselves to Roman lordship and the benefits that go with it, will never again, even in the extended future that progresses beyond the end of time itself, experience hunger or thirst, or the heat of wandering and separation that their forebears once experienced in the post-Exodus wilderness and the post-Babylonian exile. So here we catch another glimpse of where all of this is headed, where the whole book is headed, in fact. Along with his assurances and comfort in the midst of trial, Revelation taps yet again into the prophetic tradition, visions of a future without pain, sorrow, suffering, and everything else that runs counter to the values of God's realm. But there is still one more jab at Rome's inadequacies here. In John's quotation of Isaiah 49 verse 10, he changes one short phrase. Where it originally read, for he who has pity will be their shepherd, John writes, for the Lamb in the center of the throne will be their shepherd. Shepherding metaphors had long been part of the prophetic traditions within Judaism, and then on into Christian writings in the first centuries. It was a stock metaphor for king, and in Rome that meant Caesar. He was meant to shepherd the people. The cult of the Roman emperor, with all of its appeals to nationalism, promised that its shepherd would lead them to endless peace and prosperity, a promise it could not keep. Instead, it brought suffering, greed, and death to many peoples. In fact, it slaughtered the very Lamb now placed at the center of God's throne, victorious over Rome's cruelty and providing the comfort Rome would not offer. Some final thoughts. Lost in the mismatch and confusion of Revelation's chaotic scenes are these moments where the hope and comfort this book is meant to bring really shine through. This is such a scene. There has been much debate about the 144,000 who were sealed for protection and the deepest meaning behind the great multitude. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses believe that exactly 144,000 first century Christians will be resurrected, unscathed at the climax of what they think of as the end times. I'm not using this moment to disparage or comment on this belief or the witnesses generally, but only to state what I think is true. When we become so narrow in our interpretations of Revelation's symbolisms, we may well miss the forest for the trees. In the end, it does not matter who identifies with either the 144,000 or the multitude. The purpose of these verses is to assure those living that their faithfulness will not have been in vain. Your, mine, our faithfulness will not have been in vain. God has sealed 12 times 12 times 1,000 for protection, which is to say the complete and whole amount, all on earth that may be called out of the muck and the mire of humanity's messes. The specific number is not the point, nor do I think it is given here. How many will respond faithfully in times of struggle remains an open question. But even if I and the Bible scholars are wrong, even then it does not matter much. For those bodies are destroyed, for those whose bodies are destroyed for their faithfulness to Jesus will find themselves numbered among the great multitude in either case. Either way you cut it, God will see us through. Now, with this assurance, we are called to bravely engage the world with the love of Jesus. We are called to refrain from accommodating any spirit of any age that would call us away from our moral compass as Jesus' disciples and servants in the world. Come what may, God will guide us through to a joyous conclusion we can only now cling to in faith and in hope. This is the primary reading list. These are the books that I have drawn from the most. If you have any questions or comments, please send them to me. My email is Heath, Heath at indncc.org. That's Heath at indncc.org. And our next class will be next Tuesday, a week from today, July the 7th, the same time and the same places as we've been having them, namely here online in these recorded lessons and in the library at Northwood at 6:30. The topic will be on Revelation chapter 8, the seventh seal, silence, and then trumpets.